Hey, welcome back. Sebastian here. So time for my power rankings for the 2025 Mexico City Grand Prix. Pretty eventful Grand Prix, a lot of drama, like I mentioned in my review yesterday. So yeah, getting started right away with the driver that I put in number 20, and that is none other than Racing Bulls. Let's see if we can find the right tab here. None other than Racing Bulls, Liam Lawson. So for Lawson, a bit of a tough weekend. Makes a mess of Q2. Isn't really able to set a clean lap, two very, very scruffy laps, so ends up qualifying 15th, and technically gets out-qualified by his teammate Hadjar by 1.2 seconds, so bit of a poor qualifying session there. Of course, at 1.2, 1.3 seconds is not representative, but still, the qualifying session was not very good. And then in the Grand Prix, contact with Sainz on the opening lap. Probably a bit of a 50-50 there, a bit of blame on Sainz, a bit of blame on Lawson for that, and retires with car damage shortly after. So again, poor qualifying definitely weighs him down, and Grand Prix was so short. Again, contact opening lap, so don't feel I can really, put Lawson too high. Maybe you could justify putting him a position or two higher, but still not, I don't think any more than that. Alright, number 19 is Mr. Q1 himself, Lance Stroll. So for Stroll, qualified 19th, out-qualified by Alonso by about 0.4 of a second, even got out-qualified by borderline F2 car in the Alpine by Gasly there, so not great on that front. And then in the Grand Prix, a bit of a clumsy spin on the opening lap. Did have a bit of a recovery drive, finished 14th on the road, so 5 positions better than he started, but still overall pretty weak Grand Prix. Now, number 18 is Alex Albon. So for Albon, I think he had a bit of a tricky Grand Prix, qualified 17th, out-qualified by his teammate Sainz by 0.3, who got into Q3 and was effectively best to the rest. Knowing Williams in qualifying this year, it's possible that he was negatively affected by some of the trickiness that affects Williams in qualifying, where it's very hard for them to get the tires into a sweet spot, into a good working range, where you can have a really nice, clean, fast lap. But nonetheless, it was a bit of definitely an underperformance there in qualifying. In the Grand Prix itself, honestly not too bad, but a bit similar to Stroll, kind of moves up 5 positions and ends up finishing P12 on the road. Now, moving on to number 17, and number 17 is Franco Colapinto. So for Colapinto, qualifies 20th, only out-qualified by his teammate Gasly by 1.2 of a second, so pretty small gap there, and honestly not a terrible result, even though he did qualify 20th, I think, just because of how poor the Alpine's been recently. And then in the Grand Prix, finished 16th, which was the last classified finisher, but again, finished very, very close to Gasly on track, showing that, again, he's not that far off, I think, his Alpine teammate, but unfortunately, Alpine having a bit of a disaster of a weekend. And speaking of said teammate, that's the driver that I have in 16th, just a weekend where, Alpine was just so anonymously off the back and not really any high points. Where I can kind of, mark both drivers up. And it felt like there weren't that many drivers who I felt like had absolutely tore it off of weekends. There was a couple that we're going to talk about that I think had bad weekends, but, for Gasly and Colapinto, I felt, such an anonymous weekend. Can't really rank them up higher. So 16th and 17th it is for them. All right, now, number 15 is Carlos Sainz. So for Sainz, really strong qualifying performance. Qualifies 7th, of course, in the Williams, which was best of the rest, but unfortunately inherited that 5-point grid penalty, which he rightfully picked up for the collision with Antonelli last time out in Coda. Now, of course, the grid penalty I'm not including in the power rankings because that would have been something that I took into account last time. And yeah, the qualifying definitely, worked in his favor, but in the Grand Prix, just nothing seemed to go right for him. Contact with Lawson on the opening lap, got damage to the car on the sensors that control the pit lane speed limiter. Then basically got 2 penalties for speeding through the pits. First penalty, I can understand, you don't know the sensor is broken. And then, of course, the second time, I think, however, you should probably be a little bit more careful, err on the side of caution, and that's something that he didn't do. So bit unfortunate there. And then, of course, had that spin at the end of the race. Again, doesn't seem like the spin was his fault. Seems like the spin was caused by a hydraulic failure. So, again, not marking him down for that. But I think just kind of the overall clumsiness of, I think the second speeding penalty and, the contact with Lawson, which obviously led to his weekend kind of falling apart, contributed to him being a little bit lower on my power rankings. All right, number 14 is your former championship leader, and that is Oscar Piastri. So for Piastri, a bit of a shocker in qualifying. If I was doing this based on qualifying performance alone, I think Piastri would easily have been in the bottom 4. But I honestly thought he had a pretty fighting Grand Prix, I would say. Definitely made some good moves to the field, that decent recovery drive to an extent. And again, I think, had enough of a solid recovery drive that I think I could move him up a little bit. But for Piastri, qualified 8th, qualified by his teammate Norris by about 0.6 of a second. And again, that is his teammate who was on pole. And then in the Grand Prix, finished 5th, and I think was something like 40 seconds behind his teammate. So not great there for sure. Now, another driver in a front-running car who I feel kind of underperformed quite a bit, but I would say to a slightly lesser extent than Piastri, is Yuki Tsunoda. So for Tsunoda, qualifying actually didn't go too badly. Only qualified 11th, but was only out qualified by about 0.2 of a second. And Red Bull was 1 lap pace, was definitely not great. I think they had to make quite a few compromises to their car in order to make the race pace a little bit more satisfactory. But unfortunately for Tsunoda, the race pace was a little bit inconsistent, a little bit off. There were points during the race where his race pace was actually, relatively decent, was, within, 2 to 3 tenths of Verstappen, which for most drivers, 2 to 3 tenths off your teammates, too much. But again, this is Verstappen we're talking about. But there was a stint, I think, when he was, behind Ocon, I believe it was, or in front of Ocon, where the pace was quite poor. And that, created most of that separation between himself and Verstappen. Of course, had that 12-second pit stop, not his fault. Otherwise, he would have gotten points. So again, it's clearly still a pretty big gap between himself and Verstappen. But I did feel like it was, in terms of Tsunoda's overall performances this season, it was definitely in the top half for him, which unfortunately is not saying a whole lot, just because the overall average performance level has been so low. All right, moving on to number 12, and number 12 is Fernando Alonso. Actually, I'm going to put the driver number 11 too, because, very, very similar weekend. So, 11th, Hülkenberg, 12th, Alonso. Hülkenberg qualified 13th, out-qualified his teammate Bortoleto by about 1.6 of a second, then retired from the race with a mechanical DNF. Similar situation for Alonso, qualified 14th, so 1 position behind Hülkenberg. Out-qualified his teammate Stroll by 3.7 of a second, and then retired from the race with mechanical DNF. So, very, very similar weekends. They both were in the positive in the sense that they out-qualified their teammates, but didn't really go far enough in the Grand Prix. And again, both of them retired relatively early. And so I think 11th and 12th is a good, decent spot for them. Now, moving on to 10th. 10th is Esteban Ocon. So normally, for a Haas driver finish 9th in the Grand Prix, usually that would be, a top 6, top 7 finish in the power rankings. But of course, when you look at where Ocon's teammate finished, that puts a lot of it into perspective. So for Ocon, qualified 12th, but did start 1 position higher. Only out-qualified by Behrman by about 0.5 of a second. And given recent performances, that is actually an improvement. But still, this is Behrman's first time at Mexico, at least in the Grand Prix. I think he's driven here in a free practice session before, but still not great, especially when you look at the overall historical trend of rookies struggling at Mexico. In the Grand Prix, finished as 9th, so again, solid drive. I think there's probably a little bit more pace there, given what we saw from Behrman. And so for Ocon, there's a limit to how high I can rank him, so I think 10th is a decent spot for him. All right, number 9 is Lewis Hamilton. So for Hamilton, very up and down weekend. Qualifying was definitely the highlight for him. Qualified 3rd, only out-qualified by Leclerc by 0.09 of a second. So a relatively small gap there. And putting himself P3, which is in some ways was actually the best spot on the grid for the Grand Prix. I think was rightfully felt a little hard done by the fact that, Leclerc basically cut the corner in turn 1, 2, 3. And then didn't give the position to his teammate. So I think, if that doesn't happen, you could have a very, very different Grand Prix, and perhaps Hamilton's having his maiden Grand Prix of the season. Unfortunately, how things went is that Hamilton had to go into lift and coast mode very, very early. Made him quite vulnerable to Verstappen. Verstappen, of course, attacked, being Verstappen. And that basically led to a chain of events, which led to Hamilton taking a pretty egregious, track limits cutting basically turns 4 and 5. And that pretty rightfully picked him up a 10-place grid penalty. I think the alternative, in hindsight, looked a lot better, and that was definitely, a mistake from him on Hamilton's part, locking up into that corner, and again, the decision to not give the position back as well. So I think it really limits how high I can rank Hamilton, but yeah, I think 9th is enough for him. All right, number 8 is Isaac Hadjar. Hadjar, I think, had a really tricky weekend, and to be honest, it's hard to... it's kind of hard to, put him, higher, but it's also, I could have easily justifiably put him lower, but I think just a lot of drivers were kind of in this very anonymous, mushy middle, makes it hard to rank a lot of them. So for Hadjar, qualified 9th, that became 8th with Sainz's penalty, so I think qualifying honestly went pretty well. Ill-qualified lost him by, over a second, but again, not a representative gap there, but still, for Hadjar, getting the car into Q3 is a very solid achievement. Then in the Grand Prix, just pace was pretty poor. Ends up finishing 13th on the road. And that's, of course, with, 2 retirements to Alonso and Hülkenberg, who were kind of in the same ballpark as him. So again, a little bit of a disappointing result in the Grand Prix. Probably could potentially put him a couple positions lower, but still, I think the qualifying result was strong. And yeah, hard to really... And then he was also in the points-paying position until very, very late on, too. All right, number 7 is Gabriel Bortoleto. So for Bortoleto, I think this was an important weekend for him. It's a weekend where he showed that he can, get into the points-paying positions, even starting well outside the top 10. In the past Grand Prix where he's finished in the points, he's generally relied on starting in the top 10 and then kind of maintaining that position. So the fact that he was able to start outside and move his way up into 10th shows really strong race pace. And again, that's a big improvement for him. And not for this year. I think he's probably going to lose the teammate head-to-head when it comes to points, but I think it could be a really big factor that determines the head-to-head next year when he, of course, he and Hülkenberg are Audi's initial driver lineup. But yeah, really solid overall weekend for Bortoleto, even though he got out-qualified by his teammate, which did kind of hold him back a little bit here. Kind of showed there was a little bit more pace there over one lap, but still I think solid recovery drive and gets a point for his efforts. Now we get to number 5 and number 6, and to be honest, this was a weekend where I felt there was a really big separation between the top 4 and everyone else, which made it kind of difficult to rank basically everyone going down to arguably, Colapinto or even Albon. But number 5 and number 6, I'm going to do them together. So number 6 is Antonelli, and number 5 is Russell. So Russell won the teammate qualifying head-to-head here. Qualifies 4th, Antonelli 6th, separating Max Verstappen, separated by Max Verstappen in 5th, of course, with just a gap of 0.08 of a second, basically. So really, really small gap there, which again does show good improvement from Antonelli. But I thought Russell was honestly also very impressive in out-qualifying Verstappen as well. Now, in the Grand Prix, I think Russell can somewhat rightfully feel a little bit hard done by the sequence of events that ends up with him finishing 7th in the Grand Prix. But that being said, he was not that much. I think while his raw race pace was probably a little bit stronger than Antonelli, he again did ask the team to invert positions with him to basically put him ahead. And then when he was unable to get past Behrman and then subsequently passed by Piastri, rightfully, those positions were reversed. So I did feel like Russell was kind of the marginally stronger driver this weekend, even though he does end up finishing behind him in the points. Again, I think that was more circumstantial than a true pace difference between the two of them. But still, I think both of them, did decently well this weekend, on a weekend where Mercedes, I felt, were definitely the 4th best car overall. Although, actually, to be honest, you might be able to put Haas's race pace, you could have argued, was maybe a little bit quicker. But to be honest, I think, thinking on it, I think, he was always kind of under pressure from drivers behind. So probably Mercedes was 4th fastest, but just by a little bit. Now, getting into the top four, and I think, like I said, the top four, I felt like there was a big separation between themselves and everyone else. I thought all four of these drivers had really, really strong Grand Prix weekends. So first up in number three, not number 4, is number 3. I guess I mixed up. Actually, let's see. Yes, okay, we're going to do number 4, and then we're going to talk about number 3. So number 4, of course, is Max Verstappen. Qualifies 5th. I felt like qualifying was a little bit tricky. Perhaps could have gotten 4th. Maybe with a perfect lap gets Q3, or not Q3, gets P3, which I think would have put him in a position to potentially take the lead on the opening lap. But still, I think qualifying, I think, was pretty good. Then when we get to the race, of course, you have the incident with Hamilton. You have the first corner, and those incidents were a little bit messy, and I think Verstappen could have maybe done a little bit better there. But regardless, I think the second stint of the Grand Prix on the soft tires was really, really impressive. And so for me, I think 4th is a good spot for him. Number 3 is Charles Leclerc. Qualified 2nd, finished the Grand Prix in 2nd. I think just finishing one more thing with Verstappen, I think a perfect weekend for Verstappen. He could have finished P2 somehow, some way, but of course not able to do so. And for Leclerc, I think, again, very, very, an excellent weekend for him, really getting the most out of the car. A little bit fortunate with the incident at turn 1 that Ferrari didn't make him swap positions with Hamilton, but still, I think a decent weekend overall for Leclerc, and again, tied his best result of the season in P2. Still searching, of course, for that first win of the season, which at this point, with 4 Grand Prix to go, is looking increasingly unlikely. Now, getting on to the top 2, number 2, I'm going to go with Oliver Behrman. So for Behrman, qualifies 10th, of course, started 9th. Because of Sainz's penalty, out-qualifies his teammate Ocon by 0.05 of a second. Decent pace there. Perhaps there was a little bit more in the tank. Hard to say just because of how much of a discrepancy there was between the quali pace and the race pace. Usually that suggests a car that's very kind on its tires, which is something that the Haas has definitely been this year. But on the other hand, it can also sometimes suggest underperformance. Hard to say which of the two it is. But nonetheless, Behrman had an excellent Grand Prix, was very, very opportunistic, getting past Verstappen, getting past Russell during the lap 6 snafu. And then again, kind of rode out that position, track position, to a P4 result, which I think maybe with a perfect strategy, with slightly better tire management, he could have just stuck out the one lap, the one stop strategy. Maybe he could have gotten a podium. I think it would have been very hard to keep Verstappen behind, but again, you never know, especially given that the Ferrari engine seemed to be working very, very well around this track. Now, number 1 is Lando Norris, of course. So for Norris, excellent weekend from start to finish, one of his best weekends in Formula 1, without kind of that almost complete domination from start to finish. I know Verstappen was ahead some of the earlier free practice sessions, but Norris, at least compared to his teammate Piastri, looked very, very comfortable right from the get-go, and gets pulled by a pretty decent margin. I can't remember what the exact margin was, but it was at least a couple of tenths. So again, very, very comfortable pole position, and then wins the Grand Prix by 30 seconds. Again, very uneventful race. Just kind of did his own thing once he got clear of the first corner. And under those kinds of circumstances, more often than not, you're going to end up number 1 in my power rankings with that kind of performance, which is exactly where he ended up. So that's my power rankings for the 2025 Mexico City Grand Prix. Thank you so much for watching, and goodbye.